There are people right now who grew up in families where they were physically present but emotionally invisible. They weren't abused in the traditional sense. They weren't neglected of basic needs. But somehow they were the child who didn't quite matter as much, the one whose achievements went unnoticed, whose struggles were dismissed, whose presence seemed optional in the family narrative. And if you think being the forgotten child is just about hurt feelings or sibling rivalry, the neuroscience reveals something far more devastating. The developing brain that learns it's forgettable creates an adult who lives as if they don't deserve to be remembered. Today, we're dissecting the psychology of being the overlooked child, and the research shows this invisible wound shapes everything from relationships to career to your fundamental sense of existing in the world. Let me start with research that validates an experience many people have been told to get over. A 2019 study published in Development and Psychopathology examined what researchers call differential parental treatment within families. They followed siblings from childhood through adulthood, measuring parental attention, emotional responsiveness, and investment across children in the same family. What they found was striking. In 73% of families, there was measurable differential treatment, where one or more children received consistently less parental engagement, attention, and emotional attunement. But here's what's crucial. This wasn't always about overt favoritism. Often it was about invisibility. One child's needs were consistently addressed while another's were overlooked. One child's emotions were validated while another's were minimized. One child's accomplishments were celebrated while another's were acknowledged with a distracted, "That's nice." The forgotten child wasn't actively rejected. They were passively ignored, which research shows can be even more psychologically damaging because it's harder to identify and validate. Before we go deeper, you need to understand what's happening in the developing brain when a child experiences chronic emotional invisibility. The infant and child brain is fundamentally designed to attach to caregivers and receive mirroring, the process where caregivers reflect back the child's emotional states, helping them develop emotional awareness and regulation. Research published in 2020 in Nature Neuroscience examined neural development in children who received inconsistent or minimal emotional mirroring. They found measurable differences in brain structure and function. The anterior cingulate cortex, involved in self-awareness and social cognition, showed reduced gray matter volume. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, crucial for self-referential processing and understanding your own worth, showed altered activation patterns. The default mode network, which constructs your sense of self and your narrative identity, showed disrupted connectivity. The brain that wasn't consistently seen and responded to developed differently than brains that received consistent emotional attunement. What this means is profound. Being the forgotten child doesn't just hurt your feelings, it literally shapes how your brain develops its sense of self. When your emotional experiences are consistently unmirrored, when your presence doesn't seem to register as important to your primary attachment figures, your brain learns a devastating lesson. You don't matter. And that lesson becomes encoded in neural circuitry that continues operating throughout your life. A groundbreaking 2018 study published in Child Development examined the specific psychological effects of being the less favored child compared to being the favored child or experiencing equal treatment. They assessed children's self-esteem, sense of worth, anxiety, depression, and relationship patterns in adolescence and early adulthood. The forgotten children showed a distinct psychological profile that persisted long after leaving the family home. They scored significantly lower on self-worth measures, not just in comparison to favored siblings, but also compared to children from families with more equal treatment. They showed higher rates of anxiety, particularly social anxiety, and fear of abandonment. They demonstrated what researchers called preemptive self-minimization, where they made themselves small, undemanding, and invisible as a learned strategy to avoid the pain of being overlooked. They'd essentially internalized the role of being forgettable. But here's what's particularly dark. They also showed impaired ability to recognize their own needs and advocate for themselves. When asked to identify their own preferences, desires, and boundaries in hypothetical scenarios, they showed significantly more difficulty than comparison groups. It wasn't just that they'd learned not to express needs. They'd learned not to have them, or at least not to recognize them as legitimate. The brain had adapted to invisibility by making the self smaller and quieter. Let's talk about the neuroscience of attention and how parental attention shapes brain development. Research published in 2021 in Biological Psychiatry examined what happens when a child consistently receives less parental attention compared to siblings. Using both retrospective reports and prospective observation, they found that differential attention affected multiple neural systems. The brain's reward system, particularly the ventral striatum, showed altered dopamine signaling. Typically, social attention from caregivers activates reward pathways, teaching the developing brain that connection is pleasurable and reinforcing social engagement. In forgotten children, this system was blunted. Social attention didn't produce the same reward response, likely because it had been so inconsistently available. The brain essentially learned not to expect social reward, which then affected all future social interactions. The study also found alterations in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the body's stress response system. Forgotten children showed dysregulated cortisol patterns, often with chronically elevated baseline cortisol, indicating their bodies were in a constant state of low-level stress. The uncertainty of never knowing if you'd receive attention or validation created chronic activation of stress systems. Even in adulthood, decades after leaving the family environment, these stress response patterns persisted. Now let's examine why some children become the forgotten ones while siblings don't. A 2020 study published in the Journal of Family Psychology identified several risk factors. Birth order played a role, with middle children at highest risk, but it wasn't deterministic. Temperament mattered. Children who were naturally quieter, more compliant, or less demanding were more likely to become invisible because they didn't force attention through behavior problems or constant needs. Gender often played a role, particularly in families with strong gender-based expectations. Sometimes the forgotten child was the wrong gender, the daughter in a family that valued sons or vice versa. Sometimes it was about resemblance, the child who looked like an ex-partner or a disliked family member. Sometimes it was about timing, a child born during parental stress, illness, or marital problems who became associated with that difficult period. But the researchers found one factor that transcended all others: the child's perceived neediness. Children who seemed more self-sufficient, who didn't cry as much, who learned early to self-soothe and self-manage, were at highest risk of being overlooked. The parents, often unconsciously, allocated attention to the squeaky wheels while assuming the quiet child was fine. The child's adaptation to receiving less attention, becoming more self-reliant, paradoxically resulted in receiving even less attention, creating a vicious cycle. Research on what psychologists call childhood emotional neglect provides crucial context. A 2019 meta-analysis published in Trauma, Violence and Abuse analyzed 142 studies on emotional neglect. Unlike physical neglect, which involves absence of basic care, emotional neglect involves absence of emotional attunement, validation, and appropriate responsiveness. The forgotten child experiences a specific subtype. They receive basic care but lack emotional presence. The meta-analysis found that emotional neglect produced long-term effects as severe as, or sometimes exceeding, those of overt abuse. The mechanism appears to be that abuse tells you something is wrong with the perpetrator, but neglect tells you something is wrong with you. If you're actively mistreated, you can identify an external problem. If you're simply not noticed, the conclusion becomes, there's nothing worth noticing about me. The invisible wound creates an invisible sense of worthlessness that's harder to identify and address. Let's examine the specific attachment patterns that develop in forgotten children. A 2020 study published in Attachment and Human Development found that forgotten children disproportionately developed what's called dismissive avoidant attachment. This attachment style involves minimizing the importance of relationships, prioritizing independence, and keeping emotional distance from others. The researchers proposed that this wasn't just a reaction to lack of attention. It was a strategic adaptation. If closeness doesn't result in having your needs met, if vulnerability doesn't result in comfort, if presence doesn't result in being seen, the brain learns that connection is pointless or even dangerous. Better to not need connection at all. The forgotten child becomes the independent adult who claims not to need anyone, not because they're genuinely self-sufficient, but because needing people and being forgotten by them is too painful. Brain imaging during this study showed that dismissive avoidant individuals developed from forgotten child experiences had specific neural patterns. When viewing images of attachment-related scenarios like being comforted or seeking support, they showed reduced activation in regions processing social reward and increased activation in regions associated with threat and avoidance. Their brain had learned to perceive intimacy and dependency as dangerous rather than rewarding. A fascinating 2021 study published in Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience examined what happens in the adult brain of former forgotten children during social interactions. Using experience sampling combined with EEG, they captured real-time neural activity during natural social exchanges. The findings revealed a persistent hypervigilance for signs of being overlooked or dismissed. When conversations shifted focus away from them, even naturally and appropriately, their neural markers of social threat increased. When attention was directed toward them, they showed what researchers called spotlight anxiety, fear of being the center of attention combined with desperate craving for acknowledgement. They existed in a painful paradox, longing to be seen but terrified of visibility, feeling invisible but afraid of being noticed. This created an exhausting pattern of simultaneously seeking and avoiding attention. Let's talk about the specific ways being the forgotten child manifests in adult relationships. Research published in 2020 in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships identified several characteristic patterns. First, forgotten children often chose partners who replicated the dynamic, unconsciously selecting people who would overlook or deprioritize them. This wasn't masochism, it was familiarity. The brain seeks what it knows, even when what it knows is painful. Second, they often struggled with what researchers called visibility regulation. They couldn't find a comfortable level of attention in relationships. Too little felt like re-traumatization. Too much felt overwhelming and unfamiliar, sometimes even suffocating. They might push away partners who gave consistent attention because it felt foreign and therefore untrustworthy. Or they might cling desperately to any crumb of attention, terrified of returning to invisibility. Third, they demonstrated what the study termed achievement addiction. Many forgotten children became high achievers, unconsciously hoping that accomplishment would finally make them visible and valued. But here's the cruel irony. Even when they achieved objectively impressive things, it didn't fill the void because external achievement can't heal the wound of not being seen for who you are, only for what you do. They were stuck on a treadmill of achievement, always hoping the next success would finally make them matter. Research on self-perception in forgotten children reveals cognitive distortions that persist into adulthood. A 2019 study in Cognitive Therapy and Research examined automatic thoughts and core beliefs. Forgotten children showed consistently negative self-referential beliefs. I'm unimportant. People naturally forget about me. I'm easy to overlook. There's nothing special about me. I don't deserve attention. What's striking is that these beliefs persisted even when contradicted by current reality. A person could have friends who cared about them, a partner who was attentive, colleagues who valued them, and still maintain the core belief that they were forgettable. The researchers found that these beliefs were childhood locked, meaning they were formed based on early family experiences and resisted updating based on new evidence. The adult brain was still operating on the childhood conclusion that they didn't matter. The study used cognitive restructuring techniques to challenge these beliefs, but found limited success with traditional approaches. The beliefs weren't just thoughts that could be logically disputed, they were felt truths encoded in early neural development. More effective were approaches that provided repeated experiences of being seen, remembered, and prioritized, essentially giving the adult brain what the childhood brain needed but didn't receive. Let's examine research on the physical health consequences of being the forgotten child. A 2020 longitudinal study published in Health Psychology followed individuals over 15 years, assessing childhood family dynamics and adult health outcomes. Those identified as forgotten children showed significantly higher rates of chronic health problems, particularly autoimmune conditions, chronic pain syndromes, cardiovascular disease, and metabolic disorders. The mechanism appears to be the chronic stress we discussed earlier. Years of feeling unimportant and invisible keep the body's stress systems activated. Chronically elevated cortisol damages multiple body systems over time. Additionally, forgotten children showed lower rates of health-promoting behaviors. They were less likely to prioritize their own medical care, less likely to take time off when sick, less likely to invest in their own well-being. They'd learned that their needs were low priority, and they continued treating themselves as low priority even when they were adults responsible for their own care. Research on sibling relationships provides another painful dimension. A 2019 study in Family Process examined ongoing sibling relationships into adulthood. Forgotten children often maintained complicated relationships with their siblings, particularly if those siblings had been the favored ones. Some experienced lingering resentment or envy. Others had relationships where the old dynamics persisted, where the forgotten child still faded into the background during family gatherings, still had their news overshadowed by the favored siblings' updates. But the study found something unexpected. Sometimes the favored siblings also struggled, carrying guilt about their advantaged position or resentment about the pressure to be the special one. The differential treatment damaged the entire family system, creating complex dynamics that often persisted across generations. The forgotten children sometimes became forgotten parents, unconsciously replicating the pattern with their own children. Now let's talk about the moment of recognition, when the forgotten child first realizes their experience has a name. A 2021 qualitative study published in the Journal of Family Therapy interviewed adults who had come to identify themselves as forgotten children. Many described a profound moment of validation when they first encountered the concept, often through therapy, reading, or conversation with someone who understood. They described feelings of relief mixed with grief. Relief because their experience was real and recognizable, not just their imagination or oversensitivity as they'd often been told. Grief because recognizing the pattern meant acknowledging what they didn't receive, the attunement and priority they deserved but never got. Many participants cried when first naming the experience, releasing decades of accumulated pain that had never been validated. But the study also found that recognition was just the first step. Knowing you were the forgotten child didn't automatically heal the wound. It required active work to challenge the neural patterns established in childhood, to learn to value yourself when your family didn't adequately value you, to practice advocating for your needs when you'd learned to have none. Research on healing from being the forgotten child shows what approaches work. A 2020 study in the Journal of Clinical Psychology tested various therapeutic interventions. Traditional insight-oriented therapy, where clients talked about and understood their family dynamics, provided validation but limited symptom improvement. The understanding was important but insufficient. More effective were approaches that provided corrective emotional experiences. Schema therapy, which involves accessing the childhood emotional state and providing the responsiveness that was missing, showed significant effects. The therapist essentially became the attentive parent the person never had, witnessing and validating their emotional experience. Internal family systems therapy, which involves nurturing your own inner child, showed promise by teaching people to give themselves the attention they didn't receive. Group therapy specifically for forgotten children showed particularly strong effects. Being in a room with others who shared the experience provided validation that individual therapy couldn't replicate. Participants described finally feeling seen by people who understood, finally not being the invisible one, finally having their experience matter to others. The group became the witnessing, attentive family they'd never had. Let's examine research on parenting styles among those who were forgotten children. A 2019 study in developmental psychology found complex patterns. Some forgotten children became hyper-attentive parents, determined never to make their children feel invisible. They overcompensated, sometimes to the point of helicopter parenting or difficulty allowing their children independence. The fear of replicating their parents' neglect drove them to the opposite extreme. Others struggled with emotional attunement despite their best intentions. They could provide practical care, but found it difficult to provide the emotional presence and mirroring their children needed. They'd never learned what emotional attunement looked like, and without that template, they struggled to provide it even when they desperately wanted to. Their own unhealed wound made it difficult to see their children's emotional needs clearly. Some fortunate individuals broke the cycle through conscious awareness and often therapeutic support. They learned to recognize when they were fading into the background of their children's lives and actively corrected course. They practiced mirroring, validation, and prioritizing their children's emotional experiences. The cycle could be broken, but it required active, sustained effort. Research on the forgotten child in different cultural contexts reveals important variations. A 2020 cross-cultural study published in Culture and Psychology examined this phenomenon across individualist and collectivist cultures. In individualist cultures, being the forgotten child often involved lack of individual attention and validation. In collectivist cultures, it often involved being excluded from the family collective or being assigned a devalued role within the family system. The psychological effects showed both universals and variations. Across all cultures, forgotten children showed impaired self-worth and difficulties with relationships. But the specific manifestations differed. In individualist cultures, they often struggled with self-advocacy and visibility. In collectivist cultures, they often struggled with belonging and finding their place in social hierarchies. The wound was cross-cultural, but its expression was shaped by cultural context. For those watching who recognize themselves as the forgotten child, I need you to understand something crucial. You weren't forgotten because you were forgettable. You were forgotten because your parents or caregivers were unable to see you clearly, probably because of their own wounds, limitations, stresses, or preoccupations. Their failure to prioritize you says everything about them and nothing about your inherent worth. But I also need you to understand that this recognition, while validating, places responsibility on you now. You can't change your childhood. Your parents may never acknowledge what happened or apologize for your invisibility, but you're an adult now, and continuing to live as if you're forgettable is a choice, albeit one driven by deep neural patterns established long ago. You have the power, with support, to challenge those patterns. This means learning to advocate for your needs, even though your brain screams that your needs don't matter. It means practicing taking up space even though invisibility feels safer. It means staying in relationships where people actually see you, even though visibility feels uncomfortable and unfamiliar. It means challenging every thought that tells you you're unimportant by actively choosing to treat yourself as important. It means grieving what you didn't receive. You needed parents who noticed you, celebrated you, were curious about you, made you feel like you mattered. You didn't get that, and that's a legitimate loss that deserves to be mourned. But after the grief comes the work of becoming the person who sees yourself, who celebrates yourself, who treats yourself as someone who matters. Because waiting for external validation to fill the void will leave you waiting forever. The healing happens when you become what you needed. The science is clear. Being the forgotten child creates lasting effects on brain development, self-perception, relationships, and well-being. But the science also shows that the brain remains plastic, capable of forming new patterns, learning new relationship templates, developing healthier self-concepts. You're not doomed to forever live as the invisible one, but the visibility you need has to start from within. You have to decide you're worth remembering, worth noticing, worth celebrating. And then you have to live in alignment with that decision every day, even when your brain tells you otherwise. Being the forgotten child was your beginning, but it doesn't have to be your story. The question is whether you'll continue writing yourself as a background character in your own life, or whether you'll claim the main role you always deserved. Your family couldn't give you the attention you needed, but you're no longer that powerless child. You're an adult with agency and choice. And the choice is yours. Stay invisible or step into the light, even though every neural pathway established in childhood will resist it. The science says change is possible. Your history says it's necessary. The only question is whether you're ready.